Okay, now these are the geographic changes in America prior to 1900, and what you see in front of you is a map of the United States in 1783, which is when we became a country. We beat the British in the American Revolution and gained a whole lot of territory because of it. Now, prior to 1783, we had been a series of colonies. These states that you see on the map in front of you are just the modern day states. They don't indicate how things were back then when we actually became a country. This is actually what we looked like as a country in 1783. Now, if you'll notice here, our western border was the Mississippi River. There was no west coast to the United States yet at that particular time. And the nation itself was really divided in two. As even though we had all of this territory here, these areas along the Atlantic seaboard were the only things that were primarily settled. 95% of the population lived here east of the Appalachian Mountains, which is a mountain chain that runs right along here like this. Okay? 5% of the population lived out in this area here, known as the frontier. These were people who had gotten away from the cities of the colonies and the culture of the colonies to set up log cabins and live out in the frontier areas out west. As more and more people started to do that, it started to become evident that we needed to have some organization out in that area. So the Old West was going to have to be settled, and that starts with the Land Ordinance of 1785. Now, the purpose of this was to divide up the Old Northwest, and you can basically see how they did it right here. This area, right in this part of Ohio, was the very first area to be surveyed by land surveyors. And what they essentially did, now go from this cutaway view right here, or this view, to this closer look at that region of Ohio. Essentially what they did in this very first area was divide up every region into townships. The Old Northwest was surveyed and sold to pay off national debt, and they divided it into townships that were 6 miles square. Okay, you can see the different townships right here. Each one of these is 6 miles by 6 miles, as you can see from the diagram or the wording up here. Now, pretty much the rest of the Old Northwest would be surveyed in a similar fashion. And so, of course, what that meant is that the Old Northwest, which is this region right here, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Michigan in the modern day, back then just one big territory called the Old Northwest, what that meant was that it was going to be surveyed and divided up in a similar fashion to the example that you saw on the previous slide, into townships that were 6 miles by 6 miles, with each township divided into 36 sections. Each section was divided up into a half section of 320 acres, a quarter section of 160 acres, another section of 80, and 2 sections of 40 acres right here. That meant since this whole township was 6 miles by 6 miles, each one of these 36 sections was 1 mile by 1 mile, with section 16 reserved for school purposes. Now, this was greatly appreciated by the settlers because it was an orderly method of settlement, something that they had not experienced in all the settlements or in all the settling of the areas south of the Ohio River right there. This was a much better method. Now, this orderly settlement allowed for the Northwest Territory to be settled rather quickly, which brought about the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. Unlike the Land Ordinance of 1785, which had been designed to divide up the Old Northwest, the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 was about governing and settling the Old Northwest. Essentially, when a territory could prove it had stable leaders and 60,000 settlers as residents, it could apply for statehood. Now, two of the more unique groups to try to find their American dream in the Old Northwest were the Butternuts and the Yankees. The Butternuts were the first wave of new settlers to the Old Northwest Territory in the 1820s, coming mostly from Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina. They basically went across the Ohio River right here into the southern regions of Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois because they were tired of the rich landowners in the South, and frankly, they didn't want to be around African Americans either. Matter of fact, when they settled these regions right here, they enacted black codes. Now, the Butternuts were farmers who felt they could all be equal in the Old Northwest on cheap land that was very good for crops, and they wanted their own democratic community. They were perfectly happy there without anyone else being around, and then in the 1830s, the Yankees arrive. They were the second wave of new settlers to the Old Northwest, and they started arriving in the 1830s from this region here. Now, they'd been pushed out by the population growth that was happening there, and the Yankees came west to settle in northern Ohio, northern Indiana, and northern Illinois. Now, the Yankees essentially were farmers also, but they wanted to be the breadbasket to the east. They wanted to make their fortunes by growing crops out here that they could eventually transport and ship back to give to the growing population in the Northeast. But they didn't want to get rid of their old customs that they had left behind up here in the old Northeast, so they eventually wanted to create a culture here that was very similar to what was going on in the East. Well, the Butternuts didn't want any part of that at all. The Butternuts were self-sufficient farmers with no interest in mass production. They thought the Yankees were greedy, people who cheated to get their land, and the Yankees saw the Butternuts as uncivilized and being the coon dog and butcher knife tribe. The Yankees wanted public schools, roads, and canals up here, just like there were in the East, and railroads to ship products back to the East. The Butternuts opposed all of that because they figured that the Yankees would try to make the Butternuts just like them in this region. The Yankees were also mostly Congregationalists and Presbyterians with well-trained pastors. The Butternuts, in the southern part, were mostly Baptist and Methodists, and they didn't have well-trained preachers. They liked it when one of their own acted as the preacher, kind of a preacher farmer, because it was someone who was working the land just like they were. They felt like if they were closer to the land, they were closer to God. Well, the Yankees would eventually win out and have more people in control of the region, and the differences would actually start to fade a bit. In the 1840s, when Germans and Irish wanted to move into this region, the Yankees and the Butternuts actually banded together to keep the Germans and the Irish out. But old habits are hard to break, and during the Civil War in the 1860s, these regions here, these Butternut regions, became springboards for Confederate infiltration into the North, so the Confederates could cross the Ohio River and try to launch attacks in various places around here, and were also later strongholds of the Ku Klux Klan after the war. Even today, you can go into regions of the southern parts of Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, and hear people speaking with a distinctly southern accent and a lot of Confederate flags and Confederate belt buckles. So that influence is still there. So by the time we reach the end of our first decade as a nation, the country basically looks like this, heading into 1789 to 1790. If you'll notice on the right side of this map, a lot of the states that are there today look the same back then. But some others, like Virginia and Georgia, looked very different. This unorganized territory right here would eventually become Tennessee, and portions of what were Virginia and Georgia back then would later become Kentucky, Mississippi, Alabama. We already know what the Northwest Territory would eventually do, but the big thing to remember for now is that as of 1790, everything west of the Mississippi was still controlled by Spain. We wouldn't make any other major territorial purchases for another 10 years or so. But when we did, it was a big one. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803, when Thomas Jefferson bought the territory from Napoleon for $15 million. Now, if you take a look out here, this is a vast territory. Anybody that's driven out here probably knows how long it takes to drive across, let's say, Nebraska. That gives you a sense of how much territory we gained. Now, these states that are shown here just give you an idea of the modern-day states that eventually came from the territory, but they weren't there at the time. The question was, why was the territory $15 million? Well, $10 million of it was just for the city of New Orleans because it was a port city, very valuable. If someone wanted to eventually take a boat up the Mississippi River to sell products, they'd have to pay the United States now to do it, which would make a lot of money for the U.S. government. That means that the city of New Orleans was so valuable that it was $10 million of the $15 million just for that city, and all of the rest of this we got for $5 million. Now, Thomas Jefferson hired Lewis and Clark to explore the region, the Corps of Discovery expedition, that eventually went up the Missouri River, also known as the Great Muddy. They were guided by a Shoshone woman named Sacagawea and picked up a lot of valuable maps, observations, and great adventure stories. A lot of stuff about bears at that time. It also resulted in more exploration. Zeb Pike would eventually go out there later and discover Pike's Peak. But this region here was still totally controlled by the Spanish, and it would be a while before we would settle that. When we did decide that we were going to settle that region and acquire that territory in short order in the 1840s, this happened. That region that had been totally unexplored before became 1/3 of our country within about 15 years. So let's take it from the beginning. Way back in 1819, Florida was acquired from the Spanish. When we get into foreign policy, we'll get into a little more of how that happened and how the acquiring of Florida was a little interesting. In the 1830s and the 1840s, when the Yankees and the Butternuts were becoming very prominent in this region, the Old Northwest, we also picked up Texas in 1845. They had already declared independence from Mexico, more on that in a future lesson. But they became a part of the United States in 1945 after they won that independence from Mexico. We picked up Oregon from the British in 1846. We essentially just walked in and took the thing, and Britain didn't want to fight, so they said, go ahead and take it, and we generously paid them for it later on. In 1848, we got into a war with Mexico, again over the Texas issue, and that war that lasted a couple of months gave us all of this territory. Mexico losing the war meant they had to cede this territory for us, or give us this territory as the result of us winning the Mexican War in 1848, and that's why it's called the Mexican Cession. In 1853, we decided that we wanted to try to get a strip of land from Mexico to put a transcontinental railroad through, because we felt like the Rocky Mountains right here made it too difficult to build a railroad through, and we decided to take this flatland region in 1853 from Mexico. Of course, we ended up not putting the transcontinental railroad there anyway, but that's okay. And then came this, Seward's Folly, which was the purchase of Alaska from the Russians in 1867, 2 years after the end of the Civil War. Now, Russia had completely overextended themselves in North America, and they were worried about another war with Great Britain. If they got into a war with Great Britain, they would likely lose Alaska to the British anyway because they couldn't defend it. They just didn't have the resources to put in such a big territory. As you can see here, take a look at how big it is compared to the continental United States. It's easily like 1/3 the size of the country. Now, the Russians saw no value in trying to defend a region that big, and they basically thought it had been furred out. Traders and trappers, they felt, had taken everything that was in the region of value in the fur trade, and for them, for the Russians, it was an economic liability. And America wanted to buy it anyway. They wanted to have a stronger barrier on all sides of Britain, who was still in this region here somewhat, and parts of Canada. Now, since the Russians hated Britain, they were more than willing to oblige, and so Secretary of State William Seward bought the territory for $7.2 million. It was an absolute bargain at 2 cents per acre because we eventually discovered a little bit of gold there. Not a lot, but a little bit. The American public, though, mocked Seward for making this purchase, referring to it as Frigidia, Seward's icebox, and Walrussia because of the major walrus population that was up there. Now, this was also right in the middle of reconstructing the Union after the Civil War, so most people felt like the U.S. had priorities far greater than this. But America made the purchase anyway because Russia had been friendly to them during the Civil War, and because there were rumors of gold in Alaska. Now, we didn't find a lot of gold, but eventually things did pan out for us in natural resources. A major pool of oil and a lot of natural gas that we still use today. Ended up being worth the purchase. Okay, that's it. Thanks for listening.